Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has unveiled a date for the Voice referendum, kicking off 6 weeks of political campaigning. Inflation is slowing much faster than expected, potentially giving mortgage holders a reprieve next week. And Meta shuts down almost 8,000 accounts after discovering a Chinese campaign of misinformation. Welcome to Fear and Greed Business News, Australia's best business podcast. It is Thursday, the 31st of August, 2023. I'm Michael Thompson and Sean Aylmer is still away. With me instead is Jennifer Duke. Jen, good morning.
Good morning, Michael.
Now, Jen, after the show, you have an interview coming up with Carl Duncan, who is the CEO of NRG One. This is an interesting business.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. Carl was sharing his thoughts about whether we can meet our emissions reduction targets. We talked through the sort of support that businesses need and some of the opportunities to make cost savings through investing in green energy. It's a pretty good chat.
Yeah, it is worth a listen. It's coming up a little bit later on. The main story, though, this morning, Jen, a date has finally been set for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice referendum. October 14 is when 17.5 million Australians will head to voting booths to say yes or no.
This is going to become a landmark date that will be forever in Australia's history books. And that's kind of regardless of which way the vote goes. So for the Voice to be successful, they need a majority of yes votes, both in overall numbers as well as a majority of states, not territories though. And it was no accident that Prime Minister Anthony Albanese chose Adelaide to make the announcement of the date yesterday. Now, Albanese says that constitutional recognition is supported by more than 80% of Indigenous Australians. And he says it will lead to practical change and positive outcomes. He used his speech announcing the date to call on people to rise to the moment and recognise the First Peoples of Australia.
Why was Adelaide chosen? Is it important for South Australia in particular?
Yeah, so New South Wales and Victoria are considered the states most likely to be voting yes. There's a couple of states where the no vote is pretty much more assured, and so there's almost some swing states, and South Australia fits kind of firmly in that category.
Okay, so then what can we expect in the weeks ahead? I mean, this is going to be 6 weeks of what you would imagine fairly ferocious campaigning.
That's right. And this is the first referendum in about 25 years. So it is a once-in-a-generation opportunity for Australians to vote. It's compulsory. You can pre- and postal vote, but it's going to be a massive, massive time of campaigning from both the yes and the no camps. Worth remembering that only 8 out of 44 referendums have successfully passed since Federation. So there will be a big ramp up in corporate campaigning as well. Earlier this week, more than 450 company directors signed up to back the Voice, and the majority of ASX 20 companies are publicly supportive. I suspect we're going to see a lot more businesses making noise.
Yeah, I suspect you might be right. The campaigning, has it kicked off already?
Yeah, the Yes23 campaign held events across the country yesterday. In Sydney, former Liberal Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull joined forces with Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek. They were handing out flyers at Potts Point for anyone who was there. And Greens leader Adam Bandt was out supporting in Melbourne. But we know there's some significant opposition to this politically from the coalition, and there has been declining support from the public. Right now, the polling suggests the no vote is ahead. The opposition is criticising a lack of detail, and there are multiple alternatives being floated, such as a legislated voice. Albanese has been pretty clear, though, that for him, this is pretty much all or nothing.
Yeah, we're going to be hearing a lot about this. And obviously, from the business perspective, we are a business podcast. And this is something that you mentioned before, Jen, that a lot of Australian businesses are actually taking a fairly kind of firm stance on this one. So it's one of those points where business and politics kind of collide.
Definitely. It's going to be really interesting, particularly if the no vote does go through, to see how companies respond when they've been so strong on the yes side.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, local markets, how did they perform yesterday?
So the S&P ASX 200 closed up 1.2% to 7298 points. It was green across almost all the sectors, with the exception of consumer discretionary and communications, which fell just slightly. Industrials and healthcare did best over the day. In terms of companies, the best performer was BrainChip Holdings, which was up 9.1%, followed by Helios Limited, up 7.8%, and transport and logistics company Brambles, up 7.1%. The worst performer was Chalice Mining, which plummeted 25.2%. That was after a scoping study about a new metals mine, which Chalice said likely wouldn't complete in terms of a feasibility study until mid-2025, meaning production won't kick in until 2029. Building company Boral Limited fell 8% following Kerry Stokes' Seven Group's decision to trim its holding.
Yeah, there's a bit happening. What about international markets?
So in the US, job openings dropped in July to their lowest level in about 2.5 years. It's the sixth decline in the last 7 months, and it's a weaker result than expected. There's less confidence in the market right now. And this is economists thinking that the Federal Reserve will probably keep interest rates unchanged in September.
And there's plenty of action in China at the moment.
Yeah, its biggest banks are getting ready to cut interest rates for mortgages and deposits. Bloomberg reports that two major banks, China Construction Corp and the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, will cut rates later this week for the third time in a year. This is a move to get more cash flowing around the economy, including into the stock market. Confidence just isn't crash hot in China right now, and there's been plenty of stories about the economic slowdown. We've spoken about a lot of them. But Beijing still wants to safeguard financial stability and make sure they don't squeeze bank margins too much.
Okay, we'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Jen, there are strong signs that inflation is slowing for good. The latest data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics found the Consumer Price Index increased 4.9% in the 12 months to July. Now, I have a suspicion, a bit of a hunch, we can call it, that in your day job as economics correspondent for Capital Brief, you would be keeping a rather close eye on this.
I think your hunch is very much right. It's a must-watch for anyone keeping an eye on the economy right now. In particular, because we've got an RBA board meeting next week where they're going to be deciding on interest rates. Inflation is a major part of that, obviously. And the peak of annual inflation was 8.4% in December.
And so this would be good news then for mortgage holders? Another hunch, perhaps?
I think that's also a very good hunch. Inflation remains above the RBA's target of 2 to 3%, but it's heading down much more quickly than most economists were expecting, which will be a bit of a source of comfort to the central bank's board. Most of the economist notes published yesterday said this is an extra reason for them to stay on hold.
Now, it's always interesting to kind of dive into some of the data behind these figures. Were there any interesting details anywhere within this?
Yeah, no surprises that housing was the biggest contributor in July, up 7.3%. Food and non-alcoholic drinks were also up significantly, but this was offset by petrol, down 7.6%, and fruit and veg, down 5.4%. But over the 12 months to July, electricity prices were up pretty significantly.
Yeah. Now, this is an interesting story, Jen. We mentioned this at the top of the show. Meta has shut down almost 8,000 Facebook accounts targeting users in Australia and also in other countries with political spam and misinformation. This is part of a Chinese... this is my favourite part of this whole story. It is a Chinese spamouflage campaign. Am I even saying that right?
That is right. It's a great word, and apparently the Australian Strategic Policy Institute actually came up with it. And ASPI, which is that institute, helped with the investigation with Meta, and they started their investigation in 2019. They found more than 500,000 people were following one or more of these malicious accounts. The network of spammers originated in China and targeted many regions, and it posted positive commentary about China, criticisms of the US, and it lashed out at critics of the Chinese government, even including journalists and academics. The operation also tried to claim that COVID originated from the US. Now, I had a little look through the report and it had this giant list of headlines from fake articles and posts. And there was one that I had to share with you because it said, "The real version of the Matrix, the United States is monitoring the world." I actually kind of thought that was a bit clever.
This is fantastic.
I mean, it's borderline believable.
Oh, yeah, I just love the fact that the Australian Strategic Policy Institute came up with the name spamouflage. It's just so catchy.
It's great. It's really great.
Oh, well played, ASPI, which is not a sentence I thought I'd ever say. Now, a big German energy utility company called RWE has met with the Australian government to pledge a $6 billion renewable power expansion here.
Yeah, the chief executive of the company, Markus Kreber, is planning a 13-fold expansion of its existing Australian business to add 3 gigawatts of capacity by 2030. The Financial Review reported that this extra growth will be from wind, solar and storage projects. And interestingly, Kreber was brushing off concerns about Australia's transition, saying the same problems are happening worldwide and everybody needs to be pushing in the same direction. He signed a deal with Stanwell to deliver up to 10 gigawatts in renewable projects by 2035. Feels like people offshore are a lot more positive about our ability to transition to net zero than we are.
It's nice. Hopefully we import a bit of that optimism as well as the know-how. Now, Jen, Future Fund Chairman Peter Costello has warned that investors appear to be pricing in a Goldilocks scenario despite major challenges for markets.
Share markets have been surprisingly strong over the last 6 months, but Costello is warning that downside risks are growing. He's particularly concerned about inflation staying higher than markets expect due to wages and price pressures, and therefore interest rates staying higher for longer. He also said there's a risk for developed economies facing a recession as the full impact of higher rates hasn't been felt yet. The Future Fund posted a 6% return for the year to June. That's below its 10% target, but it is still above its 3, 5 and 10-year targets, and it has a 7.7% average annual return since it was created in 2006.
Plus-sized women's fashion brand City Chic has posted a $23.8 million loss as shoppers reduce their spending.
It was a really glum result for the Australian clothing chain, which last year had a $53.8 million profit. Sales revenue fell almost 16%. It recently exited its Britain and European businesses, but still has physical shops in Australia and an online store here and in the US. The retailers reviewed and overhauled operations, which prompted the downsizing overseas, and it's also going to refocus on higher value clothes and revamping the clothing line.
In those kind of circumstances, what would be classed as higher value clothes? Are we talking like jackets?
Your guess is as good as mine on this one, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I don't think either of us really know what we're talking about in relation to that one. You best go on with the business side of things, Jen.
No, I think so too. There has been some rationalising of warehouses and factories and supply chain consolidation. And in a trading update alongside the results, City Chic said it was quickly clearing winter stock in Australia and New Zealand and summer clothes in the US, which was hitting revenue. But it needed to do this to get ready with new seasonal stock. But I'd say that most fashion retailers are probably doing the same thing at this time of year.
Yes, I would imagine so. Flight Centre has posted $301.6 million in underlying earnings for the last financial year. That compares to the year before when they had a $183 million loss. That is a big turnaround story, but it seems that investors were a tad lukewarm yesterday.
Yeah, that's right. Shareholders welcome the return of dividends, which will be paid for the first time since before the pandemic. The final dividend is 18 cents per share fully franked. And Flight Centre Managing Director Graham Turner said the turnaround exceeded their own expectations and they'd benefited from the removal of restrictions imposed on travellers during COVID. He said travel seemed to be holding up well compared to other sectors right now, and corporate trips in particular have been strong. But it wasn't all good news, and the market was pretty subdued in response. Revenue margin is increasing, but the business expects it to remain below historic levels. This is because of rapid growth in lower revenue, lower cost businesses and sectors like online leisure and independent travel agents.
Okay, one last one before we get to international news. The Financial Services Regulator has written an open letter to 30 major banks and lenders telling them they must make sure that struggling everyday Australians are being supported.
Yeah, the Australian Securities and Investments Commission is unfortunately noticing a lot more people in financial distress as the cost of living rises. So it's told lenders that they've got to support customers in hardship. This includes the big four banks. They've told lenders what they expect from them, including informing Aussies how they can see assistance and genuinely consider customer circumstances while trying to come up with sustainable solutions. Because of how expensive everything has become and the stress that families are under, ASIC is going to make this much more of a focus over the next 12 months. They're currently reviewing 10 major lenders to understand how hardship is managed.
Okay, turning to international news now. Russian President Vladimir Putin is making his first trip abroad since the announcement of a warrant for his arrest from the International Criminal Court.
Putin will be going to China in October for the Belt and Road Forum, according to the Financial Times. This is his first visit to China since February 2022, which, don't forget, was just weeks before he ordered the invasion of Ukraine. And he hasn't actually left Russia, with the exception of Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine, since the warrant was issued by The Hague in March on alleged war crimes. He didn't attend the BRICS summit in South Africa last week, and he isn't attending the G20 summit in India in September either.
Now, one last one, Jen. Have you ever ordered takeaway, for instance, and discovered that it doesn't look quite as good as it did in the advertising? This is something that Burger King is facing in the US. There's actually a lawsuit over this problem, specifically the size of its Whoppers in reality versus the way it looks in the ads.
Yeah, I'm really not sure what to make of this one. So apparently, angry customers have a bit of a beef with the $30 billion burger chain, and they've started a class action. Did you enjoy the pun there? I thought that was a good one.
Yeah, and the way that you just kind of rolled straight through it, you just dropped it and moved on.
I know, I have to take a minute though to enjoy it. They're saying that the in-store menu boards made the burger look 35% bigger, very specific, than they actually are, and appear to have double the meat. Part of the claim is that the pictures look like the ingredients overflow the bun, whereas in real life they kind of don't. Burger King doesn't reckon its burgers need to look exactly like the picture and tried to get the case thrown out. But a US judge has upheld it. Even more interesting, McDonald's and Wendy's are facing similar cases in New York, and these lawsuits are seeking millions in damages, so it's no small fry.
Oh, did you just do it again?
Two puns. That's
Two
right.
puns. But you know what? I know it's not really my position to kind of pass judgment on this, but I'm on the side of the class action. There is nothing more frustrating than when you kind of open it up and it's a bit kind of floppy and a bit kind of gross. and you're like, this is not how it looked. And especially if it's kind of overflowing the edge of the bun in the pictures, and then it's actually not even meeting the edges.
I feel like this is a massive first world problem.
Oh, well, yes, but I mean, you got to take a win where you can get it. On that note, up next is the Fear and Greed Daily interview with Carl Duncan, CEO of NRG One.
Yeah, it's a bit more of a serious conversation, but it's something that all businesses should think about if they're looking at the energy transition, ways that they can make the most of green energy in their businesses.
Yeah, it's a good chat. It's coming up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. And if you haven't listened to the episode of How Do They Afford That came out yesterday, definitely worth a listen. It's all about frequent flyer points and how you can use them to basically kind of get free flights or get business class upgrades and things like that. It's basically your masterclass in how to use points to fly better. You can find that wherever you listen to podcasts, and I'll put a link in today's show notes as well. Thank you very much, Jen.
Thanks so much, Michael.
It's Thursday, the 31st of August, 2023. Make sure you're following the podcast and join us online on LinkedIn, Instagram, X, and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Fear and Greed Business News. Have a great day.